There won't be many people complaining about the rain in eastern Australia this year. It's ended years of drought in many places and filled dams, creeks and rivers. It's good news for fish too. There's been a lot of work in the last few years trying to restock areas of the Murray-Darling Basin with native fish. The rain will help them, but it's also a boon for their biggest competitor, the European carp. Clarke looks at the latest efforts to control this unwelcome visitor.
Over the past few months, Lake Albert, near the mouth of the Murray, has been transformed. Winter and spring rains in southeastern Australia have made their way down the river and filled the lower lakes. It's turned Lake Albert into a happy hunting ground for Keith Bell, who's built a business pursuing one of Australia's most significant aquatic pests, the carp.
This fish here is around about 3.5, 4 years old. It's a male fish, and it's ready to spawn. We'll just take that fish and take a fillet off the side of it, and the belly flap, this lower part, comes off the fillet, and that's a bit that we send overseas for human consumption.
Years of drought have taken their toll on carp numbers, but they're highly adaptable fish. If there's not enough water for them to breed, they'll bide their time. And the drought-breaking rains this year have provided perfect breeding conditions. Mature carp have been spawning throughout the Murray-Darling Basin.
These are carp that are in the lower end of the Murray River system. They've basically come up into these shallows now that the water's risen and the bung's been cut, and so they're up in here because this is a perfect spawning ground for them.
Spawning time is the time to catch mature fish, and Keith Bell's turned that into a business proposition. From Lake Albert, these carp will take a 10-hour road trip to Victoria's Gippsland region. It's the first stage of a journey which will send them to the other side of the world. In Australia, carp are a pest and not welcome at the table. But in Europe, Asia and parts of the Middle East, there are ready markets.
Most of the stuff that we send away ends up either in Europe or Middle Eastern countries.
Keith Bell's managed to create a product from almost every part of the fish. The fillets will go for human consumption and pet food. The swim bladders end up as fining agents in winemaking. There's even a market for the skin.
The skin's now used in leather products. That'll range from things like purses to belts to wallets, those sorts of things. We're just in the process of commercialising it now.
The key to his operation is roe, the eggs. Carp produce a massive amount of roe, up to 15% of their body weight. It ends up in Europe as a fish dip, a sort of poor man's caviar. And it was Keith Bell's saviour during the drought.
The roe's been the crux of us being able to keep this going. The whole ecological status of what's happened with the drought coming, as the fish quantities die off, all the juvenile fish are not there anymore, which are the ones that are for canning and that, and the fillet market. Now, those fish, because there's been no fish spawning for 4 or 5 years, we've only got the big adult fish left. The big adult fish are the ones that are really good for us for the roe.
The drought cut Keith Bell's business to the bone. The coming of the rains now promises a return to better times.
The heavy rainfall will start the cycle going again. Over the last few years, basically we've removed more carp than anybody else except for Mother Nature. I think we've done near on 27,000 tonnes since I started in 1984, and that's a lot of fish, believe me.
These decades of experience also mean that Keith Bell's closely involved in the latest concerted efforts to remove carp from the country's waterways. Lake Cargelligo is part of the Lachlan River catchment in central West New South Wales. And it's here that New South Wales Fisheries is focusing much of its carp control effort. This adult carp's been fitted with a radio transmitter.
He's gone.
Dean, what's the idea there?
Well, that was our first Judas carp, of one of 12 that were released in the lake, and he's got a radio transmitter on his back, and over the next 2 years, he'll lead us to his friends and family. That's why they're called Judas carp. We'll follow him with the radio receiver, find out what bay he's in, and either ourselves or Keith Bell or commercial fishers can come and net that bay and get out winter aggregations or spawning aggregations of carp.
A year ago, Lake Cargelligo was dry, and an estimated 100 tonnes of carp lay dead on its parched bed.
It's gone quiet again.
But a few months later, the rains came, and eventually, mature carp from the river system found their way here.
Yeah, I'm getting a stronger signal from that way again. We found out a few years ago that carp don't breed everywhere through river systems. There's certain areas within river systems where almost all of the recruitment or the spawning occurs. And within the Lachlan, we know there's at least 3 or 4, and Lake Cargelligo is one of those breeding hotspots. A high proportion of the carp in the Lachlan catchment were born in Lake Cargelligo.
It's a conclusion borne out by the number of small carp Keith Bell's been catching over recent months. Carp aren't sexually mature for 3 or 4 years, but when they breed in great numbers. That's their survival strategy.
Keith, how many fish have you been getting out of Lake Cargelligo in the last few weeks?
About 200,000 a day. The first trip we did, we got over 500,000, and that would have equated to about 100 tonnes of fish if they had got to adult size.
As the winter and spring rains filled the lake, many of the adults that spawned here have returned to the river. The task now is to catch those that remain and as many of their tiny offspring as possible. Natural predators will do some of the work, but only up to a point.
It's a fight between me, the pelicans and the cormorants to see who can get the most of them out. Pelican eats around about 10 kilos of fish per day, and a cormorant around about 2 kilos of fish per day. So while they're at this size, the birds and Mother Nature do a really good job of keeping them down. But the problem is, once they get over that 3 kilogram stage, there's no natural predator. Basically, I'm the only predator.
Carp are blamed for a lot of things, but the main reason for trying to get rid of them is to increase the stocks of native fish.
Carp may actually prevent the recovery of a lot of native fish populations because the baby carp are competing with the baby native fish for exactly the same food supply. So while there's millions of baby carp mouths eating the same thing as the baby native fish, there's a lot of competition.
And make no mistake, carp are extremely successful colonisers. Across the Murray-Darling Basin, it's thought they make up as much as 90% of the fish biomass. So, is this even a battle that can be won?
Data that's been modelled and published from the US is that you need to get carp biomass down to about 10% of what its impact levels are. So we've got to get about 9% of the carp out of the system. So what we hope is that we'll get carp numbers down, the native fish will recover, and then the native fish will take care of that long-term role of maintaining carp levels at a low abundance.
Out on the lake, netting's the main weapon deployed against carp. Primitive and effective. But it's a strategy with limitations. The more fish you catch, the harder it is to find those that remain, which is where science steps in. When female carp are ready to breed, they release pheromones to tell the males it's time to get cracking. And that's the basis for these field trials, to see if carp can be surgically implanted with pheromones and used to trap others. It means catching mature carp and learning the basics of riverbank surgery. The fish are anaesthetised and Dean Gilligan makes a small incision in the belly of the carp. Then a little pump with pheromone is slipped into the body cavity.
Okay, these are an osmotic pump. You inject hormones or other chemicals into it and it slow releases it over a period of 2 weeks. So it forces the fish to produce pheromones that it would normally only secrete for about 10 minutes that attract male carp. It forces them to do it for about 2 weeks.
Half a dozen stitches later, and after half an hour in the recovery ward, The fish is transferred to a net and on its way to the river, to be a live lure in a netted trap.
It is normally, when they aggregate around the female to spawn, they really jostle and wrestle for position, so they're probably more likely to enter a net and be less cautious than what they would be otherwise.
Dean Gilligan and his team have set up various sites on the Lachlan River where they're trialling the pheromone traps. What they know so far is that it works in the lab. What they need are field trials that show it's worth the time and effort.
If this technology works, it's going to be great because it'll make it a lot easier for us to catch carp in large numbers, as well as the abundance goes down to, the coup de grace to get the last one out. But it's an experiment. We don't know whether the technology works.
To appreciate just how difficult it is to eradicate carp, it's worth visiting the lakes of Tasmania's Central Highlands. For 15 years, they've been trying to remove carp from a couple of lakes here. They think they've managed it in one, and in Lake Sorell a year ago, they thought there were fewer than 50 left.
So these are fish that were bred last spring. They're so just on 12 months old. We believe that about 18,000 fish were in that spawning group. We have taken over 14,000 of those out of here now. Last year, our estimates were saying there were less than 50 carp in the lake. We ended up catching 37, so our numbers were pretty close.
So in 12 months in this lake, you can have 18,000 fish from fewer than 50 breeding.
And that's a low number. This is from intense fishing pressure. Those 37 fish that were left in there, we caught a lot of those before they spawned. So this is only from a very, very small number of females. Potentially there could have been millions in here from that one spawning group.
On Lake Sorell, they're using just about every technique in the carp fighter's handbook. There's electro-fishing with backpacks, where a current momentarily stuns fish, allowing them to be netted. They've been using Judas carp as well, the fish with radio transmitters. And they've been experimenting with pheromones.
So the ones that aren't penetrating into the marsh, we'll catch them as they're coming along the fronts of the barrier nets. It's the same way that the eel fisherman's is working.
But even with all the technology in the world, the trusty net still plays a big part.
There's not one easy answer. You've just got to throw every single technique you possibly can at them. There's no one single technique that'll work. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the more likely you are to succeed. And it's just hard effort. You've got to put a lot of effort into trying to remove these things. 1 o'clock the rain. Hello.
So now we've had enough data from these for the eggs. I've put another F2 male in there so we can get some breeding data from that now.